Well, good morning, everyone. Um, Here we are on Zoom again. Um, the title of my talk today, and it's going to have to be shortened, is "Things are not as they seem, nor as they are they otherwise." So I think we'll shorten it to "Not as they seem, nor otherwise." This is courtesy of Norm, and I have come to love this expression after hating it and not understanding it. But then I do my usual emotional swing back and forth. Um, so this talk was prompted by two things. One was actually three things. One is a phone conversation I had with a friend, and this friend said that he felt we were living in morally ambiguous times, or this was a time of moral ambiguity, or something like that. And rather than keep my mouth shut and asked him what he meant by that, I then opened my mouth and said things like, well, I think we get very confused by our ideas about morality. I think we have many ideas about good and bad, right and wrong, and they confuse us. And as Dogen has said in the Shohak Makusa, one of his fascicles in the Shobogenzo, morality is a very practical, straightforward matter. Now, I have to confess, there's much about that fascicle I simply don't understand. But at some point, I'm going to talk about it because I find it very beautiful. But I think one of the fundamental messages of the fascicle is that morality is very straightforward. And we know, in fact, what morality is, because we are living truth, we are truth, as Norm has said repeatedly. We are awakeness and awareness itself. I'm sure you're getting tired of hearing me repeat this. And as Steve has said, we are living life as Buddha. Buddha is not, we're not having any different experience from that of a Buddha. We are Buddha, as his teacher used to remind his students over and over. So with regard to the issue of moral ambiguity, I thought that the whole phrase or the whole sentence, things are not as they seem, nor are they otherwise, sort of embodies our ideas about ambiguity. And I don't want to ignore what's going on. And I found this very interesting editorial in the New York Times that I picked up on Friday at the Seward Co-op. So I'm going to start with that because I want to talk a little bit about race and the moral ambiguity of our understanding of the term race. Anyway, this editorial in the New York Times is by a man named Marvin Blakely. And Marvin Blakely is an attorney, a litigator, a Black attorney. And he is with a firm. He's a partner in the firm in Narrowsburg, New York. And he's talking about the recent events. He starts out with his experiences as a Black man getting an education. Not surprisingly, he says he was called a racial slur by his Catholic high school classmates in Western Massachusetts. Then he was an undergraduate at Yale. And he said, as a freshman there in 1974, I was expected to remain silent in an auditorium at a debate about the intellectual inferiority of Black people. I could divert there, but I won't. Maybe I'll come back. And then he says, as a litigator, and that he does trial, he's a trial attorney, which means he's in court all the time. As a litigator, I have appeared in court with clients and faced white adversaries who assumed that I could not possibly be the lawyer. I have been profiled and falsely arrested twice. So then he talks about this trip he made after his younger brother, Tony, died in Knoxville. And this occurred just days before the first shelter-in-place orders occurred. So he talks about the ride back north, his drive back north. And he talks about what he heard over the news in this drive, culminating, he said, by the time of George Floyd's killing, the isolation caused by COVID-19 had eliminated all of the distractions from our collective lives. I began to receive calls and emails from random white people in my life. Excuse me, I'm taking a drink. He says, some were friends, others classmates from over 40 years ago. Some were former coworkers or tennis partners. Some sat on charity boards with me. And he said they all felt the need to check on him. Him, the Black person, they all knew personally, who discussed race and inequality under the law more often than they liked. So I'm gonna cut to the chase. So they're asking him for advice. What do I do? So that seemed to me to be the heart of what my friend was referring to when he mentioned moral ambiguity. And unfortunately, I cut him off, but we can resume this conversation. What is it that we do in the face of what's going on? What can we do? What is moral to do? Another way to put this question is, what is right action? Right action is one of the steps on the Eightfold Path. And to give a rather pat answer, and I admit it's pat, but there's profundity there, and it's not original to me. Right action is the acting out of the whole. It's not acting out of one's own motives or desires or inclinations or leaning of mind. It's acting out of the whole. How do we do this? Perhaps there's some ambiguity about this. I would say yes, but I was very intrigued by what he said when his friends started asking him, what do I do? What do we do? And he said, how do I answer them? He said, how do I help these friends understand that the solution to the race problem, get this, lies with them? He said, ultimately, a conversation is just more talk. What about taking action, no matter how small? If they truly wanted to be of help and have meaningful conversations with me or anyone else, I decided to tell them that they should begin by acknowledging that the problem lies in the hearts and minds of them, their brothers, sisters, parents, and in-laws. I was very intrigued by that answer. I guess I would have stopped at the problem lies in their hearts and minds. We can't really know or control or anything else what's in the hearts and minds of others, our brothers, our sisters, our parents, our friends. We can't know that, but we can know, and we do know, what's in our own hearts and minds. So I would have stopped there, but that's okay. He goes on. He says he would tell them three things. Conversation in which you acknowledged, in which you, meaning the white person, acknowledged years of undeniable oppression and then suggested that Black people move on was as offensive as taking no action and remaining, as he put it, complicit. Now, I might question whether or not taking no action is remaining complicit. I might return to that. There's a lot to be said about that. And I think I will return to it, but I want to remind everyone of what Steve has said. Steve Hagen has told the story about Yakusan and his teacher, who was wanting to know what he was doing. And at one point in this conversation, Yakusan is sitting in meditation, and his teacher, Sekito, asks him what he is doing. And Yakusan says, "I'm not doing anything." And then his teacher says, "So then you're sitting idly." And Yakusan says, "If I were sitting idly, I'd be doing something." And then Sekito says, "So what is it that you're not doing?" And Yakusan says, "Even Buddhas can't say." So he's sitting in meditation, and we can't really say what sort of action he's taking, but he's saying he's doing something, but we can't say what that is. So let's keep that in mind as sort of a background to this. So after saying that, he says he would ask, this man, Marvin, would ask people to educate themselves before engaging in those conversations that white America suddenly finds necessary. And he says also, listen. This is very important, listening. When I hear that, I think of also listening without views, without our own views of what the person is saying, just listening. Then he goes on to say, after completing steps 1, 2, and 3, acknowledging the problem lies with them, possibly remaining silent, and then 3, educating themselves and listening, he would he said, then maybe they'd be ready to act in a manner consistent with our mutual humanity. A wonderful expression, our mutual humanity. He said, we agreed. So then his friend got an idea. He took this man Marvin's advice, and he started organizing a vigil to remember George Floyd and call for an end to racism. So, and they agreed, his friend and Marvin agreed that this should occur in his community, a predominantly white county in New Jersey. And then he planned to send invitations to 18 churches in the county, to members of the boards he and I sat on, and to other civic-minded organizations. So Marvin commends his friend, assures him that he would be there, that Marvin would be there, but warns him not to be discouraged or disappointed by the response that he will receive. So this man hoped to have 40 or 50 people at this vigil in the town square on a Sunday afternoon in June. On that day, Marvin joined the group of 9 people who showed up, 1 minister, and Marvin was the only person of color there. He said, we stood with our End Racism Now sign for over an hour as cars full of people newly liberated from lockdown drove past. Some blew their horns in support. Others, caught by the traffic signal, looked away or shouted that all lives matter or blue lives matter. The vigil ended with a prayer led by the 1 minister who attended. As Marvin drove home, he said he felt conflicted. On the one hand, he felt anger and disappointment with America's breach of contract essentially unchanged. But then he said, and then he said, my dark skin remained a source of discomfort for some. And I want to comment on that. Every week it seemed Black people were still dying at the hands of police. And then he said, on the other hand, the months of isolation had been filled with images of protests, marches, and vigils by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people worldwide. He says, His memories, Marvin's memories, now include the action taken by a group of 10 on a Sunday afternoon in June. And to me, for the first time in a very long time, that action looked like hope. I was very struck by this. I also wanted to talk a little bit about what he said. My dark skin remained a source of discomfort for some people. I think that's what he said, some people. So David and I used to live in what we fondly referred to as the hood in North Minneapolis. And every day I found myself, while I lived in the hood, confronted by my own discomfort with people with black skin, by my own prejudices, my own biases, my own unfounded and inaccurate assumptions about the people with whom I lived every day. And I was practicing then, and I didn't try to shove this away. I did try to pay attention to it, but perhaps not as carefully as I might have. But that doesn't matter. I do notice, interestingly enough, that I don't know how many of you drive the freeway these days, but people drive like maniacs down 94 and 35. And as people are racing past me, I can see them in my rearview mirror. They're coming up behind me, getting closer and closer. I'm getting more and more nervous. And then I speed up a little bit. I'm not a fast driver. And they'll go around me either to the right or to the left. And I'll notice the driver. And I notice I have a different, and I can't characterize in what way, a different visceral reaction to a person of color being behind the wheel than I do to a white guy being behind the wheel. So clearly I have to keep paying attention. So, and then just today, interestingly enough, David told me that he'd heard on the radio that Don Samuels, who was a Black businessman and was on the Minneapolis City Council, and in fact represented David and me when we lived in North Minneapolis. And I think he even came to our door one day when he was campaigning for his seat on the City Council and talked to us, a very engaging guy. He has now started a prayer tent. And in this prayer tent, you go, we haven't been there, and you can sit, I assume sit, for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in prayer. 8 minutes and 46 seconds being the amount of time that Derek Chauvin kept his knee on the neck of George Floyd and ultimately deprived him of his life. So I've taken no action so far, but I'm seriously considering going to this prayer tent and just sitting with whomever is there and just sitting. And I've decided if anybody asks me, which they may totally ignore me, which would be fine. If anybody asked me what I was doing, why wasn't I praying out loud or whatever, I would say, I'm just being with, or maybe not say anything, or say, I'm listening to prayer. I don't know yet, who knows? But this may be some action I choose to take. But I want to actually get back to another question, another issue that was generated by the last talk I gave. A woman in the audience, and I can't remember her name, wanted to know, I must depend on psychology. As a psychologist, she would expect me to depend on psychology in my daily life for guidance, for what to do, for help and understanding. And I suspect my answer came across as somewhat rude, possibly disrespectful, possibly dismissive. And I feel bad about that. But I didn't mean to. What I said was, I don't depend on psychology. And I didn't really explain that very well. I guess I view psychology as useful, like many ideas, many thought systems, many ways of interacting with other people, with the contents of our minds. Psychology is useful, but ultimately confusing, because like all thought, it's delusion. And I don't mean for that to be disrespectful, but I can't rely on it. I can't rely on it. So then I was thinking, David and I, after meditation every day, we sit for 30 minutes together, and then we recite something from one of the chant book, from our chant book. And we've been reciting the Heart Sutra. And in the Heart Sutra, it says, with nothing to attain, the Bodhisattva depends on the perfection of wisdom, and the mind is no hindrance. And hang on. I find that a most intriguing statement. With nothing to attain, the Bodhisattva depends on the perfection of wisdom. So this is not our usual way. This is not our typical way of approaching anything. First of all, generally we want to get something from some endeavor, any endeavor that we do. We want to attain something. So that's one way in which this is different. Another way in which this is different, it says that the Bodhisattva depends on the perfection of wisdom, and the mind is no hindrance. Let me just say something about the word Bodhisattva. We are all Bodhisattvas. We are all Buddha. So there's no distinction being made here between Bodhisattva and non-Bodhisattva. Let me just say that. And what does it mean to depend on the perfection of wisdom? So the Heart Sutra itself is part of the Prajnaparamita literature, the perfection of wisdom literature. And this is the literature that has changed over the century, not changed, been brought to us down over the centuries, and is a discussion basically of emptiness. So it's saying that the Bodhisattva has nothing to attain, and therefore the mind is no hindrance, because the Bodhisattva realizes the emptiness of what we consider to be things. And the Heart Sutra is all about that. But the Heart Sutra sounds like a negation of thingness, but it's not really. As I was going through this, I decided to go to Shohaku Gamura's section in Living by Vow on the Heart Sutra. And he says something very interesting. He says, first he quotes under the heading, no attainment. He quotes the Heart Sutra saying, no ignorance and also no extinction of it, and so forth, until no old age and death, and also no extinction of them. Now, I had been ignoring the also no extinction of them part. So what the Heart Sutra is saying is we have nothing to, so we think we can understand and attain something in this 12-fold chain of causation. This is a reference to the 12-fold chain of causation, which starts with ignorance, and ends with old age and death. So the Heart Sutra says no ignorance and no extinction of it, and so forth, until no old age and death, and also no extinction of them. And I was missing the no extinction of them part. And this is where I was struck by what Norm says. Things are not as they seem, nor are they otherwise. So no ignorance, things are not as they seem. No old age and death. We see ignorance, we see delusion, we see no old age and death. And that's what this is pointing to. Things are not as they seem. Appearances are not everything. But then it says, and also no extinction of them. But we can't ignore appearances. And I miss that. I've been reciting the Heart Sutra now, every day now for, I don't know, a month and a half, and I miss that part. The also no extinction of them. Our aging and death going away. Not so you would notice. But what this sutra is pointing to is how to handle this, how to handle our minds with respect to ignorance, how to handle our confusion and our upset and possibly our, I don't know, depression, despair over old age and death. It's pointing exactly how to handle them. We don't deny them, but we see them for what they are. And this is very complex. Recently, Norm, I think, read a poem by Ryokan about life and death as he was nearing his own death. That was very beautiful, but that pointed to this subtlety that's necessary when we think we're going to understand old age and death and birth, these great matters. Shohak talks about how as we approach this practice, we usually approach it because we desire truth. So we feel that something is lacking, something is missing. This is one of the first noble truth of suffering. So what do? In our usual way, we try to get it. But then we have to notice what we're doing when we try to get free of this. We have to notice exactly what it is. He says we have to examine our motives. He says, even when we help other people, we have some egocentricity. He said, regardless of how hard we practice, we cannot ignore this egocentricity. Even in our practice, even in our good deeds, we have some delusion and self-clinging. And then he says, Mahayana Buddhists found that egocentricity itself is illusion. And so we might think that, yes, I'm going to have to root out my stubbornness, my egocentricity, my desires. We desire desirelessness, which in itself is problematic, is a desire in itself. But the Heart Sutra is pointing to the fundamental illusion of egocentricity, the fundamental illusion of wanting things to be some way other than the way they are. Hence, things are not as they seem, nor are they otherwise. So this actually is total freedom. Everything has the ability to show up as it is, as appearance, as muddy water, as lotus, as whatever. There's that total freedom. They are not otherwise, and yet they're not as they seem. They're illusory. Appearances are illusory. And we don't get rid of them. No ignorance and also no extinction of it. We practice with our ignorance. I practice with my various, I notice my leaning of mind, my proclivity to be biased in my thinking about some things, about race, for example. That's another thing I wanted to read to you. We tend to think of race as genetically based, that it's somehow got some substantiality by virtue of being genetically based. But Stanford scientists in 2002 did a study that examined the question of human diversity. And they looked at the distribution across 7 major geographical regions of 4,000 alleles. Now, alleles are the way the gene works in a person with regard to things like hair color. So you get one allele for hair color from your mother and one from your father, and that gene determines your hair color. I have a hard time because hair color is such a varied thing. In my profession, they've discovered something called the APOE allele. This is the apolipoprotein E allele. This allele comes in 4, as they say, flavors. This allele influences a genetic, your predisposition to getting Alzheimer's disease early in life. So, for example, if you get an APOE E4 allele from your mother and one from your father, and you're homozygous for the E4 allele, you are more likely to get early onset Alzheimer's than otherwise. So it's sort of a gene that pushes you in some direction. On the other hand, if you get an E1 or an E2 from either parent, or let's say an E1 from one parent, or an E2 from another parent, that's neuroprotective against Alzheimer's. So the genes work in the alleles work in interesting ways, but everybody carries these alleles. So these Stanford scientists study these alleles over 7 major geographical regions, looking at 4,000 alleles. And they found that over 92% of the alleles were in 2 or more geographical regions, and almost half of them were present in all 7 major geographical regions. So they conclude, if it's not obvious, and I'm not saying it necessarily is obvious, if separate racial or ethnic groups actually existed, we would expect to find trademark alleles or other genetic features that are characteristic of a single group within a geographical region, but not present in others. But they found that only 7.4% of over 4,000 alleles were specific to any one geographical region. And even when region-specific alleles did occur, they only occurred in about 1% of the people from that region. So there is no evidence that the groups we commonly call races have distinct unifying genetic identities. And then he says, ultimately, there is so much ambiguity in what he means variation. Interesting that he uses the term ambiguity, and so much ambiguity between the races and so much variation within them, that 2 people of European descent may be more genetically similar to an Asian person than they are to each other. Things are not as they seem. But what about the nor are they otherwise part? So this is a Harvard blog, and they go on to say, even if scientists agree that race is at most a social construct, which is the current thinking about it, any cursory search of the internet reveals that the broader public is not convinced of this, After all, if an Asian person looks so different from a European, how could they not be from distinct groups? Even if most scientists reject the concept of race as a biological concept, race exists undeniably as a social and political concept. Things are not as they seem, nor are they otherwise. I thought this was just brilliant. Let's see. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little more about the Heart Sutra, and a little bit more about how we can understand things are not as they seem, nor otherwise, nor are they how we can understand what it means to depend on the perfection of wisdom, as opposed to thought or thinking or concepts, which we do all the time. The temptation to do so is so strong, to rely on what we think rather than what we actually know. So Shohak goes on to say, ignorance is always there, but it's an illusion. This means that there is no separation between samsara and nirvana. It's a contradiction, and yet that is our life. We have to practice life within samsara. Samsara and nirvana are one. Now, I might take a little bit of issue with this. The Shin Ming, Trusting the Heart Mind, says, all that can be said is not two. In this not two, nothing is separate. Nothing is excluded. So we can't really say samsara and nirvana are one, but we can say samsara and nirvana are not two different, separate places. This is where we live, in muddy water with purity like a lotus. The muddy water's not going to go away. Ignorance doesn't simply vanish. Things are not as they seem, however. They're not as they seem. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, for example, well, I like this. I'm starting to have a little bit of understanding of this. So Steve gave a wonderful talk several weeks back about Zoom and using Zoom when we meditate. And I'm not sure how it tied in, but he talked about the Zen understanding of mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. So in this, this is a koan, actually. When we first approach this practice, we believe firmly, mountains are mountains, rivers are rivers. That's it, clear-cut boundaries, clear-cut distinctions. But then as we practice, we begin to have a sense maybe that those boundaries aren't so clear, that maybe they're more permeable than we think they are, that maybe mountains are not mountains and rivers are not rivers. And we start to get, as Norm says, ideas about oneness. And I find that very intriguing. I find myself caught by ideas about oneness. How does one not get caught by ideas of oneness? One notices when one is caught by ideas of oneness. And then I can go on to get caught, for example, by noticing that I've gotten caught by ideas of oneness, and in that noticing, get caught. But always there's the coming back, the noticing. Always there's the paying attention to one's own heart and mind. As this man, Marvin, says, they should begin by acknowledging the problem that lies in their hearts and minds. That's wisdom. And then the final thing is there's seeing that there are mountains, that mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. They're seeing that things are not as they seem, nor are they otherwise. This is where we live, at that intersection, as Norm says. What is that intersection? David's here with me.
The two realities.
The two realities.
The two truths.
The two truths. The relative and the absolute. Always, we're living at that intersection. I suppose I should say more. So this is depending on the perfection of wisdom. This is depending on what we already know before we conceptualize it. Steve refers to this as wordless awareness. And sitting in meditation, and I can't really express it, I can't really explain it, I can't, but when I hear Norm will talk about, we see this, we acknowledge, for example, we see when we're caught by ideas of oneness, of togetherness, of sitting as one, whatever, we see that. And then Norm says, then resume the practice of being awake, being aware, resume the practice. And that's all he says. And I find that also very intriguing because it doesn't really tell you what to do. It doesn't really specify a particular thing to do. And it seems ambiguous. But once there's this letting go of any idea we're clinging to, any perverted view, which is a view that's tightly held, there is just this resuming the practice. And there's actually an experience of that in one's body that I can't really explain. Well, I like what Dogen says. He says many wonderful things, some of them confusing because of the beautiful poetic language he uses. But he says, when we open our hands, the Dharma fills our mouths. When we let go, maybe we can help, we can express the truth. But that's tricky. Words are often confusing, misleading, and they tend to put things into packages. And really, that's all I'm good for 45 minutes, and that's pretty much it. That's been true for a long time. So I'm going to open this up to questions or comments.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Michael.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm still not quick on the draw with this stuff.
Hi, Michael.
The race thing, this is difficult because,
Yes.
in my experience, what happens many times, I did the video so you can see I'm black. Most of you know that, whatever that is. I frequently have people, kind-hearted people who are identified as white will come to me and say, well, what should I do? And all this other stuff. And my immediate response is kind of, well, why are you asking me? I'm just a guy from New Jersey. What the heck do I know? And I think what tends to happen, and from my perspective, as a guy from New Jersey whose skin colors, whatever it is, over the years I found if I have the desire to respond to that and start telling people what to do, that fans a part of me or supports a part of me that I really don't like. And that's that desire to lecture. I find, I find myself leaning in that direction. Like, well, I have an answer, or I have this, or, oh, this is a forum for me to vent my anger. And in listening to the comments of the fellow, it reminded me of that. This race thing is as dangerous for, we'll use the term, white people as it is for black people. And it's hard to say that without being accused of, well, you're blaming the victim. I'm not blaming the victim. I'm simply saying that as a black person, or as a person who has experienced negative things in this culture, you want to be very careful that you don't get trapped into this kind of righteous indignation, so I can think, I can feel, and everything I say has some legitimacy, because it may not. And I think very often that's kind of lost. Just a very, very quick story. Last year at this time, I was in Vienna, and I sat down at a cafe that's near the main cathedral there, Die Dom. And I asked the people next to me in kind of broken German, is that seat free? Because I wanted to use the chair, and there's two women. No. And there was another elderly woman seated next to me, and I was there with my wife. And she looked at them, and then she looked at me and pointed to her skin. And I understand a little German, and she kept saying, Deine schwarze Haut, your black skin. That's why, they don't want you to sit there. And her response was so wonderful. She started talking to me. She started asking me where I was from, and we were going back and forth in German and all this other stuff. And it's like she just totally ignored the racial stuff that they were doing and opened up to what was actually going on. That I'm just a guy there from New Jersey. The waitress came over, and I said, I only want a coffee. She insisted that I remain seated, and she brought me a pastry. And I thought, what a wonderful kind of metaphor for everything you want to have happen for people who are compassionate and open and responding to race in a non-racial way. And as I was listening to you, I kept thinking about that. But anyway, I'm going on too long. But thank you. It reminded me of Vienna, a city that I love, and people that I didn't like but got over.
Michael, I do so appreciate your telling that story, and I thank you. Thank you so much. It's so good to see you. Thank you.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, Mike.
I was thinking about that study that you read, about, where there's really no scientific basis for race. And, it's occurred to me that the earliest evidence of human life comes from Africa and what is now Ethiopia. So if you trace our lineage back far enough, we're all Africans, presumably, regardless of our appearance nowadays, but, we're all Africans. And so, there really isn't any scientific basis whatsoever. But of course, the social constructs are important and we can't ignore them. It's like you say, things aren't as they seem, nor are they otherwise. So I appreciate your comments on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.